The blind woman hit the frozen ground hard, her white cane cracking against the boardwalk like a gunshot, and not one soul in Dusty Creek reached down to help her. Men stepped around her boots. A woman pulled her skirt aside. Someone laughed from across the street. And when Claire Bennett dragged herself back upright, her palms bleeding against the ice, she did not scream. She did not weep. She pressed one trembling hand flat against the saloon wall, turned her sightless face toward the light bleeding through the crack under the door, and whispered, "Please, anything left over tonight. Anything at all." If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me the city where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The eating house at the end of Larimer Street had no proper name. Most people in Dusty Creek, Texas just called it Holt's Place, the way you call a scar by the man it belongs to. It sat between a blacksmith forge and a shuttered millinery shop, and it smelled of burned coffee and old grease and something else entirely. Something harder to name, like the particular kind of quiet that settles into a building when the person who used to fill it with noise is gone for good. Caleb Holt ran the place alone. He had run it alone for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Not that he was counting. He was absolutely counting. He was 42 years old, with hands too scarred for a man who'd spent the last decade cooking instead of fighting, and eyes the color of old creek water, neither green nor gray, nor anything that a person could point to and say that's what he looked like. He was the kind of man a town used without thinking about it. The kind of man who opened before dawn and closed long after midnight and never once asked anyone to thank him for it. He wore his dead wife's wedding ring in his front shirt pocket, not on his finger, not in a drawer. In his pocket where he could feel it press against his chest every time he leaned over the stove. He told himself that was an accident the first 100 times he reached in and touched it. After that, he stopped making excuses. Her name had been Margaret. She had died of fever in the autumn of 1876, and she had taken with her the version of Caleb Holt, who knew how to look at other people without feeling like glass. He heard the cane before he saw her. It was the kind of November night that gets personal. The wind off the flat Texas plain had teeth, and the temperature had dropped hard around sundown, in the way it sometimes did out there, fast and mean like the sky making up its mind. Caleb had already banked the stove and was pulling on his coat when the sound came through the back wall, a rhythmic tapping, slow and deliberate, like someone measuring their steps very carefully in the dark. He stopped. The tapping stopped. Then quieter than the wind a voice. "Excuse me, is anyone still there?" He pushed open the back door, and the cold came in like a fist. She was standing about 4 feet away, her white cane held in front of her body at a slight angle, her head tilted toward the sound of the door opening. She was thin in a way that went past ordinary thin into something that looked like a long argument with hunger. Her coat was gray wool, the color of an old dish rag, and it was doing almost nothing against the November air. Her hair was dark, tied back severe and plain. Her eyes were open and still aimed a few degrees to the left of where he actually stood, and they did not move when he stepped forward. "Somebody here," she said again. Her voice was steady, not frightened, just careful. "I'm here," Caleb said. She exhaled slowly. "Good evening, sir. I apologize for coming to the back. I tried the front, but a man told me to keep walking." A pause. He was not polite about it. Caleb knew exactly which man that was. There were 3 or 4 in Dusty Creek who made a habit of that kind of cruelty and called it keeping order. "What do you need?" he asked. "I only wanted to ask," she said, and he noticed the careful way she phrased it. "Wanted to ask, not need, not beg, not please give me, if there was any food left over from tonight that you were going to discard. I am not asking for charity. I understand if there isn't any." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. The wind pushed hard between them. "There's stew," he said finally, "and half a pan of cornbread that won't keep till morning." Something moved across her face. Not relief exactly, more like she had been bracing for a blow and it hadn't come, and her body hadn't quite gotten the news yet. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that most people don't mean anything anymore. He stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the wind at least." She hesitated. "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. I'm telling you to come inside before you freeze standing there being polite." She almost smiled at that. It was a small thing, barely a quarter smile, but it changed the whole geography of her face for a second. She followed the sound of his boots on the floor, tapping her cane lightly to keep track of the space around her, and she moved through the back kitchen with a kind of quiet self-possession that Caleb hadn't expected. She didn't bump into anything. She didn't reach out blindly and knock things over. She just moved slowly and precisely, like a woman who had been navigating the world without her eyes long enough to have made a separate peace with it. He set a bowl on the counter nearest the stove, where it was warmest, and said, "Counters to your right, about 2 steps." She found it with the cane tip before he finished talking. She sat on the stool there and ate, and she did not make a performance of being grateful. She ate the stew steadily and quietly, and wiped her mouth with her sleeve in a way that she probably would have been embarrassed about in front of other people, but seemed to have forgotten for a moment that Caleb was still in the room. He turned away to give her the fiction of privacy, and busied himself with nothing much near the dry sink, and neither of them said anything for a while. "My name is Claire Bennett," she said eventually. "Caleb Holt." "Mr. Holt," she set down the spoon. "You didn't ask me any questions." "No. Most people ask questions first, before they decide." "Reckon that's one way to do it," Caleb said. He turned around and leaned against the dry sink with his arms crossed, not in a hostile way, but in the way of a man who has nowhere particular to be and isn't in a hurry about it. "But you already told me what I needed to know." "What did I tell you?" "You told me you were hungry and it was cold. Didn't figure I needed much else." She was quiet for a moment. "You are an unusual man," she said. "People keep telling me that. Mostly they don't mean it kindly." This time the quarter smile became something larger. Not a full smile. Something just short of it, like a door that opens 2 inches, but no further, letting out just enough light. She finished the cornbread. She did not ask for more, though there was more to give. He noticed that. He noticed the way she measured herself, the way she drew an invisible line at enough and did not cross it, as though she had spent a long time making sure her hunger never became something that embarrassed her. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "The church on 4th Street lets people sleep in the vestibule on cold nights." "Pastor Drummond's church?" "I believe so." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He knew Pastor Drummond. He knew the man locked the vestibule at 9 o'clock because he didn't like the look of the people who needed it after that hour. "It's 10:15, Caleb said. She didn't say anything. "Where do you actually sleep?" he asked. A long pause. "I find places," she said. "I manage." He looked at her. The thin coat, the cane, the careful, controlled way she held herself, like a woman spending enormous energy on not letting anyone know how bad things were. "There's a storage room off the back hall," he said. "It's got a cot in it left over from when my cook slept on the premises. It's clean. Stove runs warm enough through the wall that it doesn't freeze in there. I'll put a bolt on the inside of the door tonight so you can lock it from your side." She opened her mouth. "Before you tell me you can't accept that," Caleb said, "I want you to understand that I am not doing you a favor. That room is empty and useless, and I've been storing flour sacks in it, which is a waste of a cot. You'd be doing me the favor of making the room feel like it has a purpose." She closed her mouth. She thought about that. "That is a very well-constructed argument," she said at last. "I've had 3 years to practice talking to someone who isn't there," Caleb said. And then the words were out, before he'd thought about them, and he turned quickly back to the dry sink and pretended to look for something. She didn't push at it. She seemed to understand the shape of certain silences, what they contained, where their edges were. She just said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Holt." "Caleb." "Thank you, Caleb." That was the first night. He thought it would be one night. He told himself it was one night. By the end of the first week, she was sitting in the kitchen every morning when he came in before dawn to start the breakfast prep. her cane across her knees and her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she had figured out by then exactly how many steps it was from the back room to the stove, and from the stove to the counter, and from the counter to the back door, and she moved through his kitchen, like water moves through a known place, easy and certain. She never asked for more than he offered. She never asked for anything at all. Actually, she waited until he offered, and then she accepted in a way that was neither greedy nor falsely modest, but just real, the way a woman accepts something she actually needs. She started helping without asking. He'd come in some mornings and find that she had peeled a bowl of potatoes by feel, working slowly and carefully and leaving not much waste. Or she had sorted the dried beans into the pot. Or she had taken the rags from yesterday's cleanup and folded them into a neat pile by the door. And when he mentioned it, she just said, "I heard you bumping into them when you went to the stove." As though his bumping into his own kitchen rags was the inconvenience that needed fixing. The men who worked the morning shift started talking to her, not right away. The first few days they gave her looks. Sideways, looks the kind that didn't want to get caught. Looking, and they talked around her the way men talk around someone they've decided is a problem they don't own. But she had this quality of listening. Not the false performative listening of a person waiting to speak. Real listening, the kind where her whole body oriented toward you, her still eyes aimed somewhere past your shoulder, and her head slightly tilted, and you'd say something you didn't mean to say that much, and realize halfway through that she had been worth talking to. Tom Briggs, who cooked the midday shift and had been drinking hard since his wife left him for a railroad man 2 years back, started coming in early. He said it was because he liked the coffee better when it was fresher. Caleb watched him sit at the counter near Claire and talk about things he hadn't talked about to another living soul in 2 years. He watched Delia Marsh, who waitressed 4 days a week and cried in the storage room before every shift over a thing she would not name to anyone, start smiling before she even tied her apron, because Claire said good morning to her like she meant it. He watched Ed Garrett, who ate lunch alone at the back table every day with the look of a man who has given up on being noticed, begin to sit up straighter, because Claire had asked him once what he did for work, and then asked 3 more questions about it. Not polite questions, real ones. The kind that meant she was actually curious. She listens like it costs her something. Tom Briggs told Caleb one evening with the particular reverence of a man who has just named something he didn't know he was looking for. "Yeah," Caleb said. He was watching Claire from across the room. She was sitting near the small iron stove in the far corner, her cane upright against the wall beside her. Her hands folded on the table, and she was doing nothing at all except being in the room. But somehow, the room felt different with her in it. Warmer than the stove accounted for. Fuller than the number of people inside it could explain. People tell the truth with silence. She had told him one morning, not particularly aimed at anything, just said it the way some people say, weather observations as a fact of the world. He had turned from the stove and looked at her. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean," she said, wrapping both hands around her cup, "that what people don't say usually tells you more than what they do. You can tell when someone's carrying something. They go quiet in a different way. They move differently. The air around them changes." She tilted her head slightly. "I notice it maybe because I can't see their face. I have to listen to everything else." Caleb didn't say anything. She added not unkindly, "Like right now you're standing at the stove, but you stopped stirring about 40 seconds ago, and you haven't moved since. So you're either burned out on that pot, or there's something on your mind that you're deciding whether or not to say." He turned back to the stove, stirred. "You're going to be trouble," he said. "Probably," Claire said, and she didn't sound sorry about it at all. He found out pieces of her, the way you find out pieces of a place you're walking through slowly. Not all at once, not in a flood, but corner by corner, shadow by shadow. She had grown up in Missouri. Her father had been a schoolteacher. She had lost her sight at 16 in a wagon accident. Not a drunk driver, but a driver who hadn't been paying attention. Which she said was worse in its way, because at least a drunk had an explanation. After that, everything had reorganized itself around the blindness, the way a river reorganizes after a dam. Her mother had struggled. Her father had struggled. She had struggled but quietly, and by the time she was 20, she had made a kind of separate world for herself, inside the one everyone else was living, in a world built on sound and touch, and the particular intelligence of someone who has learned to read everything except faces. She had come west because there was nothing holding her east. She had been in Dusty Creek for 3 weeks before she found the back door of Holt's place. She had spent those 3 weeks sleeping in places Caleb didn't want to think about and eating on the particular schedule of someone who never knew when the next chance would come. "Why didn't you ask at other places?" he asked her one evening. "I did." He waited. "The general store told me to move on," she said without heat, like she was recounting weather. "The hotel kitchen man said he didn't have anything. The woman at the boarding house told me there was a woman's shelter 2 towns over, and I ought to try there." She paused. "The man at the front of your place told me things I won't repeat." "Wade Coulter," Caleb said. "I didn't get his name. Short man, red vest, likes to hear himself talk." "That sounds about right." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He's not a friend of mine," he said. "I didn't suppose he was," Claire said. "You don't seem like a man who'd be friends with someone who talks to a blind woman the way he talked to me." "No," Caleb said. "I'm not." She nodded like that confirmed something she'd already measured. He thought about that later, the way she measured people. Not by appearance, not by reputation, not by the social arithmetic that most of the town ran on. She measured them by what they did when no one was checking, by whether they stopped stirring, by what they went quiet about, by the difference between what they said and what they didn't. He had been running from being measured like that for 3 years. He pulled Margaret's ring out of his pocket that night, the first time he had done it with intention instead of habit, and held it between his thumb and forefinger for a long time in the dark. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He put it back, buttoned the pocket, and lay down. But sleep was a long time coming. There was a particular afternoon in the second week that Caleb would come back to later again and again, the way you come back to the moment before a thing changes. He had been tallying invoices at the back counter. The eating house was quiet between the midday rush and the evening crowd. Tom Briggs had gone home. Delia had finished her shift. It was just Caleb and Claire and the sound of the wind picking up outside. She said without preamble, "Caleb, I want to ask you something, and you don't have to answer it." He put down his pen. "Go ahead." She seemed to choose her words carefully, the way a person chooses footing on uncertain ground. "You have a wedding ring," she said. "I've heard you touch it. Through your shirt, I mean, I can hear the sound of it when you press your hand to your chest. You do it fairly often. Not the sound of a man who wears a ring, but the sound of a man who keeps one." A pause. "I don't know if that person is gone or gone away or something else. But I wanted to ask because I think you spend a great deal of time taking care of other people's pain, and I'm not entirely sure anyone ever takes the time to ask about yours." Caleb did not say anything for a long time. The wind outside pushed at the door. "She died," he said finally. 3 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry." "Yeah. Do you miss her?" "Every single day." Claire nodded slowly. "She would have liked you," Caleb said, surprising himself. "She was like that. She noticed things about people that they'd rather not have noticed." He let out a breath that was only partially a laugh. "She would have had you figured out in about 10 minutes. "That sounds like a gift," Claire said. "It was," Caleb said. "It was a hell of a gift." Neither of them spoke after that for a while. But the quiet between them was different now. It had shifted into something less like 2 strangers being careful, and more like 2 people who had decided without saying so to trust each other with the parts of themselves they usually kept behind a locked door. He didn't know that evening what that trust was going to cost him. He didn't know about the underground. He didn't know what she had been doing on the night she left the back room quietly long after he'd gone to sleep, tapping her cane along the frozen streets in the dark, moving through Dusty Creek, like a ghost in a worn gray coat, heading toward the places on the edge of town that most people had decided not to see. He didn't know yet, but the not knowing was running out. And the night that it ended, the night he would find out the truth about Claire Bennett, was already moving toward them across the flat Texas plain, cold and quiet and inevitable as a February storm. The storm came on a Thursday. Not the weather kind, though. The weather was bad enough, a hard north wind driving dust and dead leaves against the windows of Holt's place like they had a grievance with the glass. The other kind of storm. The human kind. The kind that starts with one wrong word from the wrong man at the wrong hour and ends with something broken that doesn't go back together clean. It started with Wade Coulter. Caleb was behind the counter when Coulter came through the front door with two other men, Hicks and a younger one, nobody had properly named, yet just called him Denny because he owed somebody a dime. Coulter was in one of his performing moods, the kind where he needed an audience and a target in equal measure, and his eyes went around the room the way a man's eyes go when he's already decided what he's looking for before he walked in. They landed on Claire. She was sitting at the corner table nearest the stove, both hands around a coffee cup, her cane leaning against the wall beside her. She was listening to Ed Garrett talk about his mule with the kind of attention that made Ed Garrett speak better than he usually did, choosing his words more carefully, sitting up straighter because someone was actually listening, and it changed the way a man talked when he noticed it. Coulter pulled out a chair at the adjacent table and sat down without being invited to anything. "Well," he said loud enough for the room to hear, "the charity case is still here." Ed Garrett stopped talking mid-sentence. Claire didn't move. "Didn't figure Holt for the type to run a poorhouse?" Coulter continued. He was smiling the wide, relaxed smile of a man who has never once been hit in the mouth for smiling like that, and therefore believes he never will be. "Though I reckon a man who talks to himself all day might appreciate any company he can get, even the kind that can't see straight." Hicks laughed. Denny looked at the floor like he was trying to be somewhere else. Caleb set down the pot he was holding, slowly, with intention. But before he could take a single step from behind the counter, Claire spoke. "Mr. Coulter," she said. The way she said his name stopped the room. Not loudly, not with any particular edge. She said it the way you say a name when you already know more about a person than they expected you to know, and the knowing is in your voice whether you mean it to be there or not. Coulter blinked. "You know my name. I know you come in here most Tuesday and Thursday mornings," Claire said. "I know you take your coffee with 2 sugars, and you always ask Delia to bring it before she's finished taking anyone else's order. I know you sit with your chair turned slightly toward the door because you prefer to see who's coming in." She paused. "And I know that last Thursday you came in 15 minutes earlier than usual, and you didn't eat anything, which means either you weren't hungry or something was bothering you enough to put you off your appetite." The room was very quiet. Coulter stared at her. "How do you know all that?" he said, and for the first time there was no performance in his voice. Just a man who had suddenly realized he was standing in a room he thought he knew the dimensions of and had just discovered a wall where he didn't expect one. "Because I listen," Claire said simply. "You'd be surprised what you can find out about a person when you stop looking at them and actually listen." She picked up her coffee cup, took a sip, set it down. "You've been watching me for 2 weeks," she said. "You walk past the front window twice most evenings. I can tell by the sound of your boots you've got a slight drag on the right heel. You slow down when you pass. I don't know what you're trying to decide about me, but I'd imagine it would be easier to just ask." Coulter's face had gone through 3 different expressions in the last 10 seconds and hadn't settled on any of them. He pushed back his chair. He stood up. He walked out of the eating house without another word, and Hicks followed, and Denny followed Hicks, and the door swung shut behind all 3 of them, and the room sat in silence for a full 3 seconds before Ed Garrett let out a breath like a man who'd been holding it under water. "Lord Almighty," Ed said quietly. "What?" said Claire. "You just made Wade Coulter walk out of a room without saying a word." "I didn't make him do anything," Claire said. "I just gave him something to think about." She tilted her head slightly. "Caleb, you can come out from behind the counter now. I could hear you getting ready to do something drastic." Caleb walked out from behind the counter. He stood and looked at her for a moment. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most reckless," he said. Probably both, she said. They usually are. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was something he almost never did during working hours. He sat and looked at her and said, "Are you always like this?" She considered it seriously the way she considered most things seriously, with her head slightly tilted and her still eyes aimed somewhere past his shoulder. "My father used to say I had no natural sense of self-preservation," she said. "Your father was a perceptive man. He also said it was one of my better qualities," she added. Caleb almost laughed. It surprised him, the almost laugh. He couldn't remember the last time something had come close to making him do that. The second week blurred into the third, and the third had a different texture than the ones before it. Something in the eating house had shifted, without anyone marking the moment it happened, the way a room fills with light so gradually you don't notice, until suddenly you can see everything in it. Tom Briggs stopped coming in smelling like last night's whiskey. He didn't mention it. He didn't make an announcement. He just stopped, and when Caleb looked at him sideways about it, Tom said without elaborating, "She asked me once what my wife's name was. Just asked it, like it mattered. Ain't nobody asked me that in 2 years." He shrugged with the elaborately casual shrug of a man who has been moved by something he doesn't have language for yet. "Figured maybe I'd try being the kind of man somebody'd want to know the name of." Delia Marsh stopped crying in the storage room before her shifts. She didn't stop crying entirely. Caleb heard her once through the wall late, and it was a different kind of crying than before. Less desperate, more like something releasing. Ed Garrett started nodding when people said good morning to him, which was a thing he hadn't done in as long as anyone could remember. None of them said it was because of Claire. None of them needed to. Caleb started watching the way she moved through the world and feeling something he couldn't entirely name, not admiration exactly, and not pity, which he'd given up on feeling about her somewhere in the middle of the first week when he realized it was deeply condescending, and she would have immediately noticed him feeling it anyway. It was something more like the feeling you get standing next to a river you thought you knew, and realizing it runs deeper than you measured. He started leaving a plate for her without being asked, and she started accepting it without pretending she hadn't been hoping for it. One morning he found $3.40 on the counter near the coffee pot. He stared at it. He picked it up. "Claire," he said. She was at the back counter sorting dried beans, which she did now most mornings before breakfast prep, working through the bowl by touch at a pace that had gotten faster over the past week. Where did this come from?" A brief pause in the sorting. "I asked Mr. Felton at the hardware store if he needed any letters written," she said. "He can't read well and he had correspondence he'd been putting off. I wrote 3 letters for him yesterday afternoon. He was generous." Caleb stood holding $3.40 and didn't know what to say. "You didn't need to do this," he said. "I know. The room isn't costing you anything. I know that too." She resumed sorting. "But I'm not interested in arrangements where one person owes and the other gives. I like things to be even." "This is more than the room is worth," Caleb said. "The coffee alone is worth it," Claire said, and she said it with the tone of a woman who has decided the conversation is finished, which it was. He put the money in the tin under the counter where he kept the breakfast float and told himself he would figure out what to do with it later. He never spent it. He just left it in the tin, and sometimes when he was counting the float in the morning, he'd touch it and think about a woman sitting in a hardware store writing letters in clear, careful script. $3.40 worth of independence. And it felt like the most dignified thing he had ever seen a person do. It was near the end of the third week when he first noticed she was gone at night. He hadn't been sleeping well. He rarely did anymore, and sometime past midnight he'd gotten up for water and passed the hall to the storage room, and the thin strip of darkness under the door was unbroken. No candlelight, no movement, just dark. He knocked anyway. "Claire?" Nothing. He stood in the hall for a moment, telling himself it wasn't his business. She was an adult woman, with the right to be wherever she chose to be. He told himself that firmly and clearly, and then went back to his room and lay awake listening until he heard the back door open sometime close to 2 in the morning, and the quiet, careful tap of her cane across the kitchen floor, and the soft click of the storage room door closing. He didn't say anything the next morning. The morning after that, he checked the time when she came back 1:30. The morning after that, 1:45. On the fourth night, he was in the kitchen when she came back sitting at the counter in the dark with a cold cup of coffee because he hadn't wanted to make a production of it with a lamp. He heard the back door, and then the tapping stopped, and she said without surprise, "You're awake." "Been awake," he said. She came to the counter and sat on the stool. Her coat was cold from outside, and he could smell the night air on her frost, and something else he couldn't identify. Something earthier and older than the open street. "You've been going out," he said. "Yes." "Every night?" "Most nights." "Until past 1 o'clock in the morning," Caleb said, "in November, in a town where you already had one man tell you things I won't repeat." He paused. "Where are you going, Claire?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to lie. The quiet of someone deciding how much of the truth is safe to tell. "There are people," she said carefully, "sleeping in the old grain storage tunnels off the south end of Larimer, under the abandoned freight depot. You know the ones." Caleb went still. He knew the ones. Everyone in Dusty Creek knew they were there, and chose with remarkable consistency not to know they were there, a particular civic skill, the ability to not know something that was inconvenient to know. "How many people?" he asked. "It changes," she said. "Some nights 4, some nights 7 or 8. There's a man, he was a soldier, I think, from the way he carries himself, the way he flinches at sounds, he's been down there the longest. His name is Amos. He doesn't talk much, but he's not unkind." She paused. "There's a woman named Pearl who is in a bad way. She needs more than I can give her. And there's an old man, Benjamin, who used to play guitar somewhere, I think, because he hums music to himself constantly, old hymns mostly, and his hands are shaped like a musician's hands." "How do you know what a musician's hands feel like?" Caleb asked before he could stop himself. "He let me hold them once," she said simply. "He was cold, and he let me hold his hands to warm them up." Something happened in Caleb's chest. He couldn't have named it. "What are you bringing them?" he said. A pause. "Claire, the cornbread," she said, "from what you were going to throw out, and sometimes the stew, if there was enough left. I took the heel of the bread 3 nights last week, and some of the dried apple you had going soft near the window. I'm sorry. I should have asked." Caleb sat there. He sat there for a long time. "You've been taking your own food," he said quietly. "The plate I set for you." She didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Claire, you haven't been eating." "I've been eating," she said. "Not what you should be." "They needed it more," she said, and she said it with the simple matter-of-fact conviction of someone reporting a mathematical fact. 2 is larger than 1, water runs downhill, they needed it more. No self-congratulation, no performance of virtue. Just a woman who had done the arithmetic and acted on it. Caleb stood up from his stool. He went to the stove. He built the fire back up, which was something he never did in the middle of the night because fuel cost money, and he got the heavy pot and ladled in what was left from dinner and didn't say anything while it heated. "You don't have to," Claire started. "I know I don't have to," Caleb said, which was almost word for word what she had said to him about the $3.40, and he heard her register it, heard the small adjustment in her breathing that meant she had heard him give it back to her. He filled a covered pail with stew and wrapped 3 pieces of the next day's bread in cloth. He set it on the counter in front of her. "Tomorrow night," he said, "I'm going with you." "Caleb, I'm not asking," he said, "and I'm not discussing it." She pressed her lips together. She looked like she was going to argue, and then looked like she had decided on reflection that she did not actually have a strong enough counter-argument. "All right," she said. "Good." "You should bring more bread," she said. "Amos eats a great deal." "I'll bring more bread," Caleb said. He stood in his kitchen at 2 in the morning with the fire going, and a woman who had been quietly starving herself to feed strangers sitting 3 feet away from him. And he felt something that was larger and older and more inconvenient than anything he had felt in 3 years, pressing its full weight against the inside of his ribs. He turned back to the stove so she couldn't hear it in his face. But she heard everything, Claire Bennett, and he knew it. And somewhere in the particular frequency of the silence that followed, he had a feeling she wasn't entirely surprised by what he was carrying. What happened the next day, though, that he had not planned for? He had not planned for Wade Coulter to come back. Not alone this time, and not with words. Coulter came back at noon on a Friday, which was the busiest hour of Caleb's week, and Caleb would later think that the timing was deliberate, that a man like Coulter understood instinctively that a crowd was both a weapon and a shield. He came in with Sheriff Dale Pruitt, which was the part that landed wrong in Caleb's stomach the moment the door opened. Pruitt was not a bad man exactly, but he was the kind of man who had spent 20 years making sure he never had to make a hard decision, which in its own way was worse. He wore his badge like a man wearing a sign he'd agreed to carry without reading what it said. Coulter walked half a step ahead of him, which told Caleb everything about who was actually driving the situation. The eating house was full, every table occupied. Tom Briggs was running plates. Delia was pouring coffee. The noise of it all dropped by several degrees when Pruitt's badge caught the light. Coulter put a folded paper on the counter in front of Caleb and tapped it twice with one finger. "What's this?" Caleb said. "Order of vacancy," Coulter said. "For the freight depot tunnels off South Larimer. County assessor signed it Tuesday. Anybody living in those tunnels has got 48 hours to clear out before the property's condemned." Caleb picked up the paper without looking at it and looked at Coulter instead. "Why are you bringing this to me?" "Because you're the one feeding them," Coulter said. He said it with the satisfaction of a man who has been watching and waiting and is now producing his proof. "Saw it myself, 3 nights running. You and her down there at midnight with a pail. Don't bother denying it." Claire had come out of the back kitchen. She was standing in the doorway to the hall, her cane in her hand, her head tilted toward Coulter's voice. "The property's condemned," she said. "That's right," Coulter said, and he shifted his attention to her with the particular unpleasantness of a man who finds it more satisfying to argue with someone he's already decided is powerless. "On what grounds?" she said. "Structural hazard. County says those tunnels ain't safe for habitation." "The county hasn't been inside those tunnels," Claire said. "I have." Coulter's expression changed slightly. "How would you—" "I don't need eyes to know whether a structure is sound," she said. "I know which support beams are solid and which ones have give. I know which sections have water damage and which ones are dry. I have walked every section of those tunnels more than a dozen times in the last 3 weeks." She paused. "I'd be willing to testify to their structural condition before any judge you'd care to name." Sheriff Pruitt shifted his weight. Coulter's jaw tightened. A blind woman's testimony about structural conditions isn't worth. "The man living in the northeast section of those tunnels," Claire said, cutting him off clean, "is named Amos Greer. He is a former sergeant of the 4th United States Cavalry. He rode at the Battle of Red River in 1874. He has a discharge paper signed by his commanding officer folded inside his coat." She paused. "The county is proposing to condemn a decorated soldier out of the only shelter he has available to him in November. I would think very carefully, Mr. Coulter, about whether that is a story you want the territorial newspaper to tell." The room was so quiet, Caleb could hear the stove. Pruitt was looking at the floor. Coulter said quietly, and without the performance this time, "You don't know what you're messing with, Miss Bennett." "Tell me," Claire said. "What am I messing with?" Coulter folded his hands on the counter. His voice dropped further. "That property sells for 3 times its assessed value the minute it's cleared. There are men with money in this deal who don't like inconveniences." "Then they'll have to find a way to tolerate one," Claire said. Caleb set his hand flat on the counter between them. "You've delivered your paper," he said to Coulter. "Shop's full. You'll want to leave." The look Coulter gave him was the kind that comes before something worse, and both men knew it. But he straightened, tugged his coat, and walked out with Pruitt behind him, and the door swung shut, and the room exhaled. Delia had stopped pouring coffee somewhere around 4th United States Cavalry, and was now standing completely still with the pot in her hand. Tom Briggs was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed and an expression on his face that Caleb had never seen on Tom Briggs before, something that looked close to fierce. Ed Garrett was sitting at the back table with both hands flat on the tabletop, leaning forward like a man ready to stand up. "Amos Greer," Caleb said, turning to Claire. "You never told me his last name." "You never asked," she said. "How long have you known about the vacancy order?" A pause. 4 days, she said. 4 days, he repeated. "I was trying to find a way to handle it that didn't require—" She stopped. "Didn't require what?" "Didn't require involving anyone else," she said. "In my problems." Oh. He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen noise had started up again, careful and subdued people returning to their food, with the particular focused attention of people pretending they hadn't been listening. "Claire," Caleb said, keeping his voice level. "Amos Greer and Pearl and Benjamin are not your problems. They're people, and you cannot handle this alone." She pressed her lips together. She said nothing, which was, he had learned the sound she made when she knew he was right and wasn't ready to say so yet. He went to the tunnels with her that night as he had the night before, and the 2 nights before that. 3 nights now since she had told him the truth. 3 nights of following her through the dark town with a lantern and a covered pail, learning the route the way she had learned it by repetition and attention. Amos Greer was exactly what Claire had described, and also something she hadn't quite described: a man in his 40s, broad through the shoulders and diminished everywhere else, sitting upright against the tunnel wall, with the particular stillness of someone who has trained the instinct toward collapse out of himself and then had it come back another way. His eyes tracked Caleb when he came in quick and professional, and then moved to Claire, and something in them eased a fraction. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Amos." She came to him with the ease of familiarity, found the wall next to him by touch, and sat down against it perfectly at home in the dark. "This is Caleb Holt. He runs the eating house." Amos looked at Caleb. "You the one been sending the food?" he said. Not a question. "She's been bringing it," Caleb said. "I've been trying to keep up." Something moved across Amos Greer's face, not quite a smile, but its quieter, older relative. Pearl was in worse shape than Caleb had allowed himself to imagine from Claire's descriptions. She was in her 30s probably, though she looked older, and she was wrapped in every piece of cloth available in the tunnel, and she still shook with cold. She barely opened her eyes when Caleb and Claire came in. She ate a few spoonfuls of stew, and then stopped, not because she wasn't hungry, but because something in her body was past the point where hunger and eating were having a simple conversation. "She needs a doctor," Caleb told Claire low, while Benjamin, old and thin, and wrapped in a soldier's blanket, humming something Caleb half recognized from a church his mother had taken him to 40 years ago, spooned stew from the pail, with the focused gratitude of a man who has learned not to take warm food for granted. "I know," Claire said. "I've been trying to figure out how." "Doc Heller," Caleb said. "I'll talk to him tomorrow. He'll want to be paid." "I'll pay him." "Caleb, I'll pay him," he said again, and he said it with the same tone she used when she was finished discussing something, and she heard it and stopped. What happened next, he would go over in his mind many times afterward, the exact order of it, the exact moment when the situation changed its nature. He had turned toward the tunnel entrance to check the light on the lantern when he heard Claire's breath change. Not much, just a fractional catch, the kind of sound that wouldn't register to most people. He turned back. She had her hand against the tunnel wall. Her head was down. "Claire, I'm fine," she said, and her voice was wrong, thinner than usual, lacking the particular steady quality that was so native to her that he had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing a sound that's always there. He crossed to her in 3 steps. "When did you last eat?" he said. She didn't answer. "Claire, when?" "This morning," she said. "What this morning?" A pause that was half a second too long. "Half a cup of coffee," she said. He said something under his breath that he would not have said in front of a woman under normal circumstances, and then he took her arm, carefully telegraphing it with the light pressure of his hand before he took hold, so she knew exactly where he was and what he was doing, and he said, "Sit down." "I don't need to." "You haven't been eating your meals again," he said. It came out harder than he meant it to. "Have you?" She sat down against the wall because her body was making the decision for her, and Amos was watching from across the tunnel, with an expression that a different man might have been embarrassed to have on his face. "How long?" Caleb said. "A few days," she said quietly. Pearl wasn't keeping anything down. I thought if I gave her my portions for a few days, she might—" She stopped. Caleb reached into the pail and got the bread, first the piece he'd wrapped separately, and put it in her hands. "Eat that," he said. There is enough, he said. "I brought more. Eat the bread, Claire." She ate it. He watched her eat it and felt something hot and dangerous moving through him, not at her, not exactly, but at the whole shape of things, at a world that had deposited a woman like this, in a place like this, surviving on half a cup of coffee, and the stubborn arithmetic of other people's hunger ranking higher than her own. Amos Greer said from across the tunnel, "She does that." Caleb looked at him. "Every time," Amos said. "I've told her. She don't listen worth a damn." "I can hear you," Claire said with a fragment of her usual tone coming back. "Good," Amos said. "Then hear this too. You nearly passed out 3 days ago and you didn't tell anybody, and Pearl cried for an hour after you left." "Pearl cried." Claire's voice changed. "Said she didn't want to be the reason you got hurt," Amos said. The tunnel was very quiet. Claire pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she brought it down and straightened her shoulders and said steadily, "I didn't know that." "No," Amos said. "You don't always know everything, Miss Bennett." He said it without cruelty, kindly, even in the careful way of a man who has learned when kindness needs to carry weight. Caleb looked at Amos Greer. He looked at the discharge paper outline visible through his coat. He looked at Benjamin still humming, and Pearl sleeping now with the shallow, unsteady breathing of someone whose body was making poor decisions. And he looked at Claire sitting against the tunnel wall, finishing the bread in small, careful bites, her cane across her knees, her still eyes aimed at nothing and seeing everything. He made a decision. He had been making decisions slowly for 3 years, the way a man moves when he's learned to distrust his own impulses, because one of the things his impulses built is now buried in the church cemetery on the north edge of town. He had been careful and measured and deliberate about everything, since Margaret and he had been entirely alone, which was the cost of that kind of carefulness. "Amos," he said. "Sir? How many people know about this place? The men who want that property." Amos's eyes went sharp. 3 men that I've counted. Coulter's the front. There's a land agent named Marsh out of Austin, and a third man I don't have a name for yet. They've been quiet about it, moving papers at the county level, not the territorial. "Yet," Caleb said. "Yet," Amos confirmed. "Can you walk?" Caleb said. "I can walk. Tomorrow morning," Caleb said. 6 o'clock. Come to the back of the eating house. Bring your discharge paper and anything else you've got. Benjamin, too, if he's willing." Amos studied him for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has been deceived before and learned from it. "What are you planning?" "I'm planning," Caleb said, "to make it very inconvenient for 3 men to throw people away." Claire had stopped chewing. She was listening with her whole body, now that full-body stillness that meant she was processing something she hadn't anticipated. "Caleb," she said. "Don't argue with me," he said. "I wasn't going to argue," she said. He looked at her. "I was going to say thank you," she said quietly. He didn't know what to do with that, so he picked up the pail and checked that everyone had eaten and helped Pearl sit up to take a few more spoonfuls. And when they walked back through the dark town toward the eating house at 1:30 in the morning, Claire's cane tapping the frost-hardened ground beside him, neither of them said anything for a long time. Then she said, "Caleb." "Yeah." "The ring in your pocket." He didn't answer. "What was she like?" Claire asked. "Margaret. What was she actually like?" He walked 3 more steps before he said, "She would have been down in those tunnels before the second night. Wouldn't have asked permission." Claire nodded slowly. "She sounds like someone worth carrying," she said. He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she realized, and stopped too, turning her face back toward him, her head tilted. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Yeah, she was." And he walked the rest of the way home with something pressed against the inside of his chest that was so large and so unfamiliar that he couldn't tell yet whether it was breaking him open or putting something back together. He was about to find out. Because what Amos Greer brought through his back door the next morning at 6 o'clock was not just a discharge paper, it was a ledger. And the name on the front of it was not a name Caleb had expected. The name on the ledger was Francis Dodd. Caleb knew that name. Everyone in Dusty Creek knew that name. Francis Dodd was the county assessor, the man who had signed the vacancy order, the man whose official seal made Coulter's land scheme legal on paper, the man who had been sitting in that position for 11 years, with the satisfied permanence of someone who had long ago decided that public office was a private business. Amos set the ledger on the counter without ceremony. Benjamin stood behind him, smaller in the daylight than he seemed in the tunnel, still humming something low under his breath. His hands, the musician's hands Claire had described, folded in front of him like a man waiting for church to start. Caleb opened the ledger. It was 40 pages of entries in a tight, careful hand. Dates, dollar amounts, initials. A column on the right that used a system of numbers instead of names. But the pattern was clear enough if you knew what you were looking at. And Caleb had run a business for 12 years and knew exactly what he was looking at. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Found it," Amos said. Caleb looked up at him. "Found it where?" he said. Amos met his eyes without flinching. "Coulter and the land agent Marsh, they met in the tunnels twice. Thought nobody was down there who mattered. Third time they came, I was in the far section. They left in a hurry when they heard something in the upper passage. Marsh dropped his satchel. I picked it up." A pause. "I meant to return it." "But you didn't," Caleb said. "No," Amos said. "Once I saw what was in it, I didn't." Claire was standing at the end of the counter. "What does it say?" Caleb turned pages. "Payments from a land account, Coulter's account. I'd reckon given the routing entries to F. Dodd. First entry is 14 months ago. Last entry is 6 days back." He stopped on a page. $80, then $120, then $200. He looked up. "He's been buying the assessor for over a year." "The structural condemnation report," Claire said. It wasn't a question. "Has to be," Caleb said. "That's how a building with sound supports gets declared a hazard in 3 weeks flat. You pay the man who writes the report." Tom Briggs had come in for his morning shift and was now standing in the kitchen doorway. He'd stopped when he saw Amos, and Benjamin stopped and looked at Caleb with a look that asked several questions at once. Caleb said, "Tom." "Yeah." "You still know the Garrett boy who rides for the territorial paper out of Austin?" Tom straightened slightly. "Jimmy Garrett. Ed's nephew." "Yeah." "You know how to reach him fast?" Tom thought for about 2 seconds. "I can get a wire to him by noon." "Do it," Caleb said. "Tell him a decorated cavalry sergeant has documented evidence of an assessor taking bribes to clear land for private speculation. Tell him there are people about to be turned into the November cold on falsified papers." Tom looked at Amos. Amos looked back at him with the particular level gaze of a man who has survived things that made lesser men stop standing upright. Tom Briggs said quietly and with feeling, "Yes, sir," and went for his coat. It was Delia who noticed Pearl first. She came through the back door 20 minutes later. Caleb had sent word with a boy the night before that the eating house back door would be unlocked at 6, and she was walking with Amos's arm under hers, and when Delia saw her, she made a sound that wasn't any particular word and crossed the kitchen in 6 steps. "Lord, honey," Delia said. And she took Pearl's other arm, and Pearl looked at her with the uncertain eyes of someone who has not been spoken to with that particular warmth in a very long time and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "She needs Doc Heller," Claire said. "Caleb." "Already sent for him," Caleb said. He had sent the same boy who'd carried the message to Delia. "He'll be here by 7, Pearl said in a voice like something fraying at the edges. I don't have money for a doctor." "I know," Caleb said. "Sit down and let Delia get you something warm." Pearl looked at him. "It ain't charity," Caleb said, and he said it the way Claire had taught him to say things like that plainly, without the apologetic softening that made people feel worse about accepting help. "It's just what's next." Pearl sat down. Benjamin took the stool at the end of the counter and accepted a cup of coffee from Delia with both hands, the way a man accepts something sacred, and went back to humming his hymn. And somehow the hymn in the kitchen at 6 in the morning felt entirely natural, like it had always been part of the sound of the place. Doc Heller arrived at 7:10, already suspicious. He'd been told only that there was a patient in need at Holt's place, and Caleb Holt's credit was good, and when he saw Pearl, he went professional and quiet and asked everyone to give him room. Claire stood near the back wall while Heller worked. She had her arms crossed and her cane in her right hand, and she was holding herself very still in the way she held herself when she was managing something she didn't want to show. Caleb came to stand beside her. "She's going to be all right," he said. "You don't know that yet," Claire said. "No," he said. "But Heller's good, and she's here now, which is different from where she was." Claire was quiet. "You got her here," he said. "That's yours." She pressed her lips together, said nothing. From across the room, Heller looked up and said, "She's got a chest infection that's been sitting a while. She needs rest, warmth, and medicine, none of which she's had." He looked at Caleb with the particular look of a doctor who has stopped being surprised by what men let happen to other people. "She'll need somewhere to stay." Caleb didn't hesitate. "There's a room," he said. Claire turned her face toward him. "The flour sack room," he said. "I'll move the cot back in." "Caleb," Claire said low. "I know," he said. I know it's a lot, but it's a room, and it's warm, and it's got a bolt on the inside." He paused. "Seemed to work all right once before." She was quiet for a long moment. "You can't take in everyone," she said, and she said it like a woman who has told herself that same thing many times and never quite believed it. "Not everyone," he said. "Just the ones standing in my kitchen." Doc Heller was writing out a prescription, and Delia was coaxing Pearl to eat, and Amos was sitting at the back table reading through the ledger again with the methodical focus of a soldier going over terrain maps, and Benjamin had moved from the counter stool to the chair nearest the stove, and was no longer humming, just sitting with his eyes closed and his hands open on his knees, in the posture of a man resting in a place that feels safe. And something about that, the open hands, the closed eyes, the specific quality of the rest, hit Caleb somewhere behind his sternum and stayed there. Coulter came at 9. He came without Pruitt this time, which meant he had decided this was past the stage of legal performance and into something more direct. He had 2 men with him that Caleb didn't know by name, but recognized by type, the kind of men who stood slightly behind and to the side of someone else and got paid to be large and present. The eating house was doing its breakfast trade, every table full. Ed Garrett at the back. 3 ranch hands from the Dawson property at the middle table. A woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who ate breakfast there every Thursday and read her Bible while she did it, which she kept doing now without looking up, though her posture had changed. Coulter put both hands on the counter and leaned forward. "I want that ledger," he said. Caleb was behind the counter. He looked at Coulter's hands on his counter and said, "You'll want to take those off my counter." Coulter didn't move his hands. "I don't know what you think you've got, Holt, but I want to be very clear with you about what happens to men who—" "Mr. Coulter." Claire's voice came from the end of the counter. Same tone as before, calm, exact, carrying in the room the way a church bell carries, not by being loud, but by being clear. Coulter turned. She was standing with her cane in front of her, and her chin level, and her still eyes aimed precisely at the sound of his voice. "You should know that a wire has already gone to the territorial newspaper in Austin, and a second wire has gone to the judge's office in the county seat." She paused. "And I have spent the last 2 days composing a letter in my own hand with specific dates, dollar amounts, and the initials used in your land agent's ledger that is currently sitting in the care of Pastor Drummond at the church on 4th Street. to be opened and delivered if I or anyone connected to this eating house is harassed, threatened, or harmed. She had the room completely. Every person in it had stopped eating. You've been paying Frances Dodd since last September, she said. 3 payments in the first quarter, 4 in the second, 2 in the third. The fourth quarter started 6 weeks ago, and you've made 1 payment which is the largest single entry in the ledger and corresponds within 3 days to the date the vacancy order was submitted. She tilted her head slightly. I had Amos read me the entries this morning. I have a good memory. One of the men behind Coulter shifted his weight. That ledger is stolen property, Coulter said, and his voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man recalculating. A judge will decide that, Caleb said, along with deciding what it means that the property it was found on is the property your vacancy order was designed to clear. You don't understand the people involved in this, Coulter said. He wasn't performing now. He was just talking low and even. Marsh has connections that reach past Austin, past the territorial level. You're standing in a 12-table eating house in Dusty Creek, Texas, thinking you can... Mr. Coulter. Ed Garrett's voice came from the back table. Coulter turned. Ed Garrett had stood up. He was not a large man, and he had never been a loud one, and he stood now with his hands at his sides and his chin level, and he said, I ate my lunch at that back table alone for 2 years. Never said a word to anybody. Figured nobody'd notice. He paused. That woman at the end of the counter asked me what I did for work and listened to the answer for 20 minutes. He looked at Coulter steadily. So I'm going to say this once. Whatever you're thinking about doing to her, or to Holt, or to those people they've been taking care of you, best think on it a second time. One of the ranch hands at the middle table had pushed back his chair and stood up without saying anything. Then the second one. Then the third. Mrs. Aldridge had closed her Bible and put it on the table and was looking at Coulter with the patient expression of a woman who has decided what she thinks and is waiting to see what he decides to do about it. Coulter looked around the room. He looked at the ledger on the counter. He looked at Claire. He looked at Caleb. He straightened. He tugged his coat. He walked to the door and his 2 men went with him, and the door swung shut, and this time the room didn't exhale so much as it slowly, carefully came back to life. Ed Garrett sat down. He picked up his fork. He looked at it for a moment and then set it down again and rubbed his face with both hands and said to no one in particular, Lord, my heart is going something fierce. Mine too, said one of the ranch hands and sat back down. Claire let out a breath that Caleb could hear from 8 feet away. He came around the counter. He stopped in front of her. The letter at Pastor Drummond's, he said. Is it real? I was there at 7 this morning, she said. Before you were up. He stared at her. You wrote it last night. After you fell asleep. Claire. I knew he'd come, she said simply. I wanted to be ready. He looked at her, at the absolute composure of her, the steady hands, the level face, and said, How are you not scared? She was quiet for a moment. I am scared, she said. I'm scared most of the time. She adjusted her grip on her cane. But scared doesn't mean stopped. It just means you're paying attention. Doc Heller came out of the back hall drying his hands and said Pearl was stable and sleeping and would need 2 weeks of rest minimum. And he said it in the tone of a man who expected an argument about the accommodations and did not receive one. And he looked around the eating house at Amos sitting at the back table, and Benjamin by the stove, and the ranch hands, and Ed Garrett and Delia moving from table to table with the coffee pot, and he said to Caleb, Something's different in here. Yeah, Caleb said. Can't quite name it, Heller said. Caleb looked at Claire. She was talking to Benjamin now, standing near the stove. Her head tilted toward the sound of his voice, and Benjamin had his eyes open and was talking back, actually talking, not just humming, and his hands moved while he talked, his musician's hands shaping something in the air that Caleb couldn't see but could almost hear. I know what it is, Caleb said quietly. Heller looked at him. It's people, Caleb said. Just people being in the same room. He paused. This place used to feel empty even when it was full. Now it doesn't. He reached into his shirt pocket. He felt the ring. He pressed it once the way he always did, the old reflex, the old grief, The old argument with a world that took things without asking. But this time, it felt different. Not smaller. Not less. Just different in its weight, less like a wound and more like a compass. Something that pointed at a direction rather than holding him in place. He buttoned the pocket. He went back to the stove. He had a lot of people to feed. Jimmy Garrett arrived on the Tuesday stage 26 years old and skinny as a fence post, with ink permanently stained into his right forefinger and the bright, slightly dangerous energy of a young man who has just been handed the kind of story he got into newspapers to find. He sat at the back table where Ed Garrett used to eat alone and spread out his writing materials and talked to everyone who would talk to him, which turned out to be most of the people in the eating house, because something had changed in the week since the morning Coulter walked out and didn't come back. People talked now in Holt's place the way people talk in rooms where they have decided collectively to stop pretending certain things aren't true. He talked to Amos for 2 hours. He talked to Benjamin, who turned out to have a full name. Benjamin Cale, and a history that went back through 3 states and a career playing piano in establishments that ranged from elegant to disreputable, and who told his story in the measured cadences of a man who has decided at this late stage that the truth of his life is worth telling even if it isn't tidy. He talked to Pearl, who was sitting up now 2 weeks into her recovery, thin but upright, with color coming back into her face, in the slow way that real recovery comes, not dramatically, but incrementally, like a lamp being turned up a little each day. He asked Claire if he could speak with her. She said yes, and they sat at the corner table near the stove for an hour and a half, and Caleb heard fragments of it from the kitchen. Claire's voice steady and precise, and Garrett's pen scratching, and the occasional silence that meant he was trying to catch up with what she'd just said. When Garrett came to the counter to settle his lunch bill, he looked at Caleb with an expression that was partly professional assessment and partly something more personal. "That woman," he said, "is one of the most extraordinary people I have ever interviewed." "Yeah," Caleb said. "She told me she's been in Dusty Creek just under 2 months." "That's right." Garrett shook his head slowly. "She talks about these people, Amos, Pearl, Benjamin, like she's known them 20 years, like their lives are worth the same as anyone else's." He paused. "Like it's obvious. Like it shouldn't even need saying." "With her, it doesn't," Caleb said. Garrett looked at him for a moment. "She told me something, at the end." He seemed to be deciding whether to repeat it. "I asked her what she wanted people to take from the story. She said she didn't want people to think of it as a story about a blind woman being brave. She said," he checked his notes. "She said, tell them it's about what happens when one person decides to see another one. That's all it ever is. Somebody decides to look." Caleb stopped wiping the counter. Garrett put his money down. "You going to be all right with whatever comes from this story running?" "We'll be all right," Caleb said. The story ran in the Austin Territorial paper on a Thursday, and by the following Monday, it had been reprinted in 3 other papers, including one in San Antonio, and by the end of the month, Caleb had received 14 letters. He counted them from people across Texas and 2 from as far as Missouri, and every one of them said some version of the same thing, which was that they had read the story and thought of someone they knew and hadn't been seeing properly. Francis Dodd resigned the county assessorship on the Wednesday after the story ran, which was faster than anyone had expected, and suggested that someone had spoken to him privately about the alternative. The vacancy order was voided by the new assessor 3 days after that, in a document that was brief and bureaucratic, and said nothing about why, which was the way of such documents, but meant what it meant. Coulter left Dusty Creek sometime in the first week of December. Nobody saw him go. His house was locked and his horse was gone, and the red vest was presumably with him. And the general consensus of the town was that this was an acceptable resolution, the way a splinter working itself out is an acceptable resolution. Not dramatic, just done. The land agent Marsh faced a territorial inquiry that Jimmy Garrett had mentioned in a follow-up article, and what came of that inquiry was not Caleb's business, and he didn't spend much time wondering about it. He had a kitchen to run, and people to feed, and a flour sack storage room that had become without any formal announcement. A place where people who needed a few nights' warmth found it. Pearl stayed 6 weeks. She left on a January morning with a traveling trunk that Delia had filled with things she didn't need anymore, plus a few things she'd bought on purpose, and she had a position in a boarding house kitchen in the next town over, obtained through a letter Caleb had written on her behalf to a woman named Mrs. Ferris, who owed him a favor from 3 years back. Pearl stood at the back door on her way out and said to Caleb, "I don't know how to," and then stopped because the sentence didn't have a proper ending. "You don't have to," Caleb said. She nodded. She looked at Claire, who was at the counter. "Miss Bennet," she said. Claire turned her face toward her. "I keep thinking about what you did," Pearl said. "Going without so I could eat. I kept thinking, why would someone do that? Why would a stranger do that?" "You weren't a stranger," Claire said. "We'd known each other 2 weeks." "That's long enough," Claire said. "If you're paying attention." Pearl pressed her lips together. She picked up her trunk. She went through the back door into the January morning, and she didn't look back. Which was the right thing to do, Caleb thought. Some doors you walk through forward. Amos stayed longer. He had no particular attachment to Dusty Creek, he said, but he had less attachment to anywhere else, and something about the latitude suited him. He started coming in at 6 each morning and doing the work that needed doing before the breakfast prep, splitting wood, carrying water, the heavy physical tasks that Caleb had always done alone and that Amos took on without discussion or ceremony, with the quiet efficiency of a man who was used to knowing what a situation required and doing it. They didn't talk much in those early mornings, but the silences between them were the productive kind, the kind that accumulate into something like understanding without requiring either man to be more articulate than he was comfortable being. One morning, about 3 weeks into this arrangement, Amos said, while stacking wood by the back door, "My sister lives in Kansas. Haven't written her in 4 years." Caleb didn't look up from the stove. "She know you're alive?" "Probably not. Might be worth telling her." A long silence. "Yeah," Amos said. "Might be." He wrote the letter that same night. Claire helped him with the wording which he asked for with the direct, unself-conscious manner of a man who has learned that asking for help with things you need help with is not a diminishment. She sat across from him at the back table, and he told her what he wanted to say, and she suggested how to say it, and they went back and forth like that for an hour. And when the letter was finished, Amos read it over twice and said, "That's right. That says it right," in the tone of a man confirming that something important has been done correctly. Benjamin was the surprise. Benjamin stayed because of the piano. There was an old upright piano in the back of the Mercantile that had been sitting unplayed since the Mercantile owner's wife had died 5 years prior. The owner, a man named Gus Fowler, had been meaning to sell it and never gotten around to it the way people never get around to things that carry weight. Caleb offered to buy it in the second week of December, and Gus Fowler said he didn't want money for it. He wanted it to go somewhere, it would be used, and they shook hands on that. The piano went into the corner of Holt's place nearest the stove. Benjamin sat down at it on a Sunday afternoon when the eating house was quiet, and he played for 2 hours without stopping. And by the end of it, there were 11 people sitting at tables who had come in for coffee and stayed without realizing they'd decided to stay, because the music did something to the air of the room that was difficult to account for and impossible to resist. After that, Benjamin played on Sunday afternoons, then on Friday evenings. Then most evenings when the dinner trade slowed, he'd sit at the piano and play softly, old hymns and older songs, things that sat at the back of people's memories and reminded them of something they couldn't name, but recognized. Nobody paid him formally. But people left money on the piano when they left, in the way people leave things at a place they're grateful for quietly, without ceremony, folded under a coffee cup or set beside the music stand. It was enough, more than enough. It was on a February evening, the dinner crowd thinned out, Benjamin playing something low and sweet, Delia counting receipts at the far table, Tom Briggs cleaning up in the kitchen, that Caleb finally said the thing he'd been not saying for 3 months. Claire was at the corner table. She had a cup of tea she'd been holding so long it was surely cold, and she was listening to Benjamin play with the full-body attention she brought to things she loved, her cane resting against the wall, her hands open on the table. Caleb sat down across from her. She knew it was him by the sound of his boots, by the particular way he pulled the chair. He knew this because she didn't turn her head or reach for her cane, just shifted fractionally in the way she shifted when someone she was comfortable with entered her immediate space. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. You've been standing in the kitchen door for 10 minutes. I was thinking." "Loud thinking," she said, and the quarter smile came. He put his hands on the table. He thought about what he wanted to say and how to say it, and decided that he had spent 3 years being precise about his silences, and it had gotten him to a place where precision was starting to feel like another word for alone. "When you came to my back door in November," he said, "I thought you were going to be one night, maybe 2. "I know," she said. "I didn't plan any of this." "Nobody plans anything real," she said. "Real things happen because someone decides, usually just once, to do the decent thing. And then the next decent thing is right there waiting." He looked at her. "You changed this place," he said. "You know that. Not me. Not what I did. You." She shook her head slowly. "I asked for leftovers." "You asked for leftovers," he agreed. "And you said it like someone trying to keep her dignity alive, and I hadn't really seen anything in 3 years." He paused. "You did that. You walked up to a back door in November with a white cane and a coat that wasn't warm enough, and you asked for what you needed without apology and without performance, and it cracked something open." She was very still. "I've been carrying Margaret's ring in my pocket since she died," he said. "You know that." "I know." "I'm not putting it away," he said. "I'm not pretending it isn't there. She was real and she mattered, and that doesn't stop." "No," Claire said quietly. "It doesn't. But I think," he said, and he said it carefully the way you say the true version of something after you've rehearsed the easier versions, that she would have told me I was wasting a perfectly good kitchen on a man who wasn't looking at anything. Claire's mouth curved. "She sounds like she was direct," she said. "Brutally," he said. "I like her," Claire said. He reached across the table. He set his hand over hers, lightly telegraphing it, before he landed the way she had taught him, without meaning to, by being a person who needed to know where things were before they arrived. She turned her hand over. She held his. Neither of them said anything. Benjamin played something that started low and became, by small degrees, something warmer, and the stove ticked, and the winter wind pushed at the window, and Delia pretended very hard to be interested in her receipts. Dusty Creek talked about Holt's place for years afterward. Not because of the newspaper story, though. That was part of it. Not because of what Caleb had done, or what Claire had done, or the particular way the vacancy order had collapsed under the weight of a soldier's ledger and a blind woman's memory. Those things mattered, and people told them. But the thing that lasted, the thing that became the way people in that part of Texas said the name of the place, was something harder to put in a newspaper. It was the Sunday afternoons. It was the piano, and the open door, and the particular smell of the stove, and the coffee, and the way Caleb Holt had taken down the closed sign one December morning and never put it back up, and the way Claire Bennett sat at the corner table and listened to whoever needed listening to, and the way people who had been eating alone for years found themselves eating in company without quite knowing how they'd ended up there. Pearl wrote from the next town over in the spring, a short letter in uncertain handwriting. She had been learning, she said, from the boarding house owner's daughter, who was teaching school. She said she was all right. She said she thought about the eating house most days. She said she wanted Caleb to tell Miss Bennett something, and the something was this: "I see people differently now. I think that's what she gave me. I didn't know I was missing it until she showed me what it looked like." Amos left in March, heading for Kansas, and his sister with a bedroll and a horse that Caleb had helped him buy from the livery at a fair price, and he shook Caleb's hand at the back door on an early morning. And then he went to Claire and held out his hand, and she took it in both of hers, the way she'd held Benjamin's hands in the tunnel that first night. "You're a good woman, Miss Bennett," he said. "You're a good man, Amos Greer," she said. "Go find your sister." He did. Benjamin stayed. Benjamin played his piano and drank Caleb's coffee and occasionally wrote music on scraps of brown paper in a notation system only he could read. And he seemed to require nothing much beyond warmth and an audience of any size, and Dusty Creek gave him both. And Caleb ran his eating house. He cooked before dawn and stayed past midnight, and he knew the name of every person who sat at his tables, which he had not always done, and he knew which ones were carrying something heavy, and which ones needed to sit near the stove, and which ones needed to talk, and which ones needed to be left in their silence with a full cup. He learned that from Claire. He learned most of the important things in the end from Claire. She stayed. She was still there in the April morning when the cottonwoods along the creek road came into leaf, and still there in the summer when the heat came down on Dusty Creek like a physical weight, and she was at the corner table or in the kitchen or sitting on the back step in the evenings with her face tilted up toward the cooling air, her cane beside her listening to a town that didn't know how much it had been telling her all along. One evening, Caleb sat beside her on the back step. He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out the ring. He held it in his palm between them and looked at it for a long time, and Claire did not reach for it or say anything, just sat with him in the particular quality of silence they had built between them over months, the kind that doesn't require filling. "She knew, I think," he said finally, "that love doesn't run out when the person does. She would have hated if I thought it did. It doesn't run out," Claire said. "It just finds new shapes." He closed his hand around the ring. He put it back in his pocket, not to hide it, not because it was a wound anymore, but because it was his history, his love, his compass, and it belonged close right there against his chest, where a man carries the things that made him who he is. He had a lot of people to feed in the morning. He had a kitchen that smelled like coffee and a piano in the corner, and a woman beside him who had walked up to his back door in November with nothing but a white cane and an unbroken sense of her own dignity. And she had seen him the way he was, the hollow and the grief, and the wasted good in him, and she had stayed anyway. You ask a man what changed him, he'll usually point to something large. A battle, a catastrophe, a moment when the world rearranged itself around him, and he had no choice but to rearrange with it. But the truth is, most men are changed by small things. A voice through a door, a hand turned palm up on a table, a woman who listens with her whole body and reminds you that being seen is not a thing to be afraid of. Claire Bennett had asked for leftovers, and in the asking she had given every single person in that eating house something they hadn't known they were starving for. The ability to look at another human being, really look past the coat and the cane and the worn-down dignity, and the story they'd already decided to tell about that person and see them. Just see them. That was all it ever took. And it was, as it turned out, everything.